All right, well, hello everybody. I'm very happy to be speaking to you about this presentation, which I've titled Spiraling Islam. So I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation. Okay, can everybody see it okay? All right, and everybody can hear me okay too? Okay, great. So the first question you might be asking is, why am I giving this presentation? Well, I have my own personal interest in Islam, which maybe I'll get into at some point later on, or maybe after the presentation. But another reason is simply that I haven't seen a lot of overlap between discussions about Islam and spiral dynamics and integral theory. There has been a lot of discussion about religion in general, and there's been discussion about Christianity and especially Buddhism. There's a lot of interest in Buddhism and the integral community, but I haven't seen a lot of discussion about Islam. And I think that's a shame because being that a large section of the world's population practices religion, I think it's sort of incumbent upon integral thinkers to get to know this religion a little better. And likewise, I think that Muslims could really benefit from understanding spiral dynamics and integral theory better. There are people that have done work. Saeed Dawabani and his wife Elsa have done a lot of work through an initiative in the Middle East. I have not delved into their work very closely, but I am hoping to do so more in the future. And I know Justin Duperma and Steve McIntosh have explored Islam a little bit coming from the integral field, but not very in depth. So it's something that I wanted to explore a little more. So the first step that I wanted to go through is just to look at Islam through a historical lens and using the spiral dynamics steps, so to speak. So we'll start with Beige, which is the place where all human populations begin, I suppose, which is at the survival stage. And in Arabia being largely desertic, the survival instinct has to be strong in order to find water and things like this. Although if we go far enough back in time, we'll see that actually this area was a rainforest, and that's why there's now large petroleum deposits, because there's so much decayed matter under the sand. But anyway, the Arabian people have always had a very strong survival instinct because of the desert environment. But next we'll go to purple, which is, where I think things really start to get interesting. So Arabia was a very tribal society, as were all human populations all over the planet. And in the city of Mecca, there was a place where pilgrims would come, and this predates Islam. We don't know how far back this custom goes, but there were many gods and goddesses that the Arabian people worshipped. And it was a people that, like most people in the tribal stage, purple stage, were also very superstitious. There was beliefs in supernatural phenomena like jinns, which actually are also in the Qur'an, which are like fairies that live in fire or are made out of fire. There was quite a bit of rivalry, as can be expected, between tribes. You can sort of see the red stage in the way that the tribes sort of fought each other, in an eye for an eye mentality. If you do this to me, I'll do that to you. Sort of the whole idea of retaliation was quite strong. On the positive side, there were very strong warriors and just a very proud people. I mean, pride can have a positive and a negative side, right? There were slaves. the custom of owning and selling slaves, which was quite common. And I actually have a couple screenshots here from two different films. The top is from a film called The Message. And it portrays one of the Prophet's companions talking to a slave. And down below, I have a shot from a series called Umar, just showing kind of like the strong warrior culture that there was. Before I go to blue, I'm just going to quickly mention the context in which the Prophet Muhammad received his first revelation. So he was a part of this society in which he lived in Mecca, and he was a part of the society where people came to worship. I believe the Kaaba was the main economic engine and the reason why people would come there. And he saw a lot of injustices. He saw that there was some people that held most of the power. The tribe called the Quraysh was the ruling tribe. And they were the gatekeepers and the ones that said who could come and who couldn't. And he saw a lot of inequality there, and it really troubled him. And so he started to go to a cave to meditate and to be in silence. He just sort of needed to get away from it all and just to sort of find himself or to find an inner. And it was in this cave that he received the first revelation where, according to him, an angel came, understood to be the angel Gabriel, which is interestingly the same angel that we understand came to Mary to give her the message about Jesus coming. And the angel told him that he should read. He commanded the Prophet Muhammad to read. And the Prophet Muhammad says, I can't read. I don't know how to read, because he was illiterate. And the angel kept saying, read. And it was understood then that what the Prophet needed to do was to interpret this message that was coming to him. What I find interesting is that later on, Arabia was largely an illiterate, well, I don't like that word, but let's just say it was an oral society, and that was quite common for tribal societies. Purple stage knowledge was passed on through speaking, through stories, not through written documents. But Islam is that tipping point where that changed. And I find it interesting that the Prophet didn't read, but what would become the Quran later on would become basically the beginning of the Arabic script. The Arabic script already existed. People would write poems, and sometimes they would hang their poems on the Kaaba. But by and large, most people did not read and write. So again, this really changed after, a few decades after the Quran came together, and actually after the Prophet said, after the Quran was put together, and it became a society of writing. So he received this message, and he was quite shaken by it. And he went and he spoke to his wife afterwards, and his wife believed that what had happened to him was real, that he wasn't going crazy, and so on. And little by little, he received more messages over time, not all at once. And at first, it was just a few of his family members, and from then other people that decided to accept this message that had come to him. And what was this message? The main message really was that there's one God, and that polytheism is not right. There isn't multiple gods, there's one God. And this is when we get this sort of unifying blue force, right? Where one belief system comes down that kind of transforms a society. And in this case, it happened very, very quickly. And I'm referring to within the life of the Prophet, the whole peninsula changing their belief system from polytheism to monotheism. That's very, very fast. Now, there were Jews and Christians in Arabia, so the idea of monotheism wasn't completely foreign. The idea of there being one God wasn't completely foreign, because Allah, the one most superior God, was already there. It's just that there happened to be other gods. So basically this message was, no, there's one God. The beautiful side that I really find about this whole unifying movement is we can really see during pilgrimage, where even today, Muslims wear all white, so you can't tell where people are from. You know, at that time, it basically erased tribal differences, which was pretty neat. And it put everybody on the same level. So it didn't matter if you were rich or if you were poor, you were the same before God. And that was a symbology that that dress has, and actually represents the white shroud that people are buried in. So what are the basic tenets of belief? Okay, so it's the declaration of faith, La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah. That means there's no God but God. And I really don't like it when I see a translation that says there's no God but Allah, because it makes it sound like there's no God but the Arab God. You know, you have to worship Allah. And I think that is very confusing, because Allah is simply the Arabic word for God, but it's no different than the God of the Jews and the Christians. So I always prefer to translate the Shahada is there's no God but God, with, you know, lowercase g and uppercase G. Belief in God's prophets, belief in angels, belief in the sacred books, so the Torah and the Gospels, except that those are legitimate vehicles through which God has communicated to humans. Believing in the afterlife, believing that there's heaven for the righteous people and hell for the evildoers. Placing a importance on prayer, on charity, fasting, and making pilgrimage a requirement. But again, it's important to remember that pilgrimage already existed in Mecca before Muhammad's message, and prayer existed, charity, fasting, all of this. So it's the biggest change really came from changing from polytheism to monotheism. But a lot of the practices that were already in place in Arab culture were maintained, or just sort of slightly modified or codified, so to speak. And again, that's what blue does, is it codifies things. But as we know, in spiral dynamics, we don't operate in one level only. And whether it's an individual or a society, we always have multiple layers operating at the same time. And even though these sort of new rules or new forms of worship came, the red and the blue were still very strong. It was still a very strong tribal society. So there was one part of Islam that was very unifying and brought people together. But on the other hand, the tribal differences really didn't go away. And we saw that after the death of the Prophet, there was a lot of infighting, trying to decide who was going to come after him, who was going to be the next leader. It caused a lot of problems. His nephew, Ali, who was one of the first people to become Muslim when he was just a child, and he was considered a very pious man and the most obvious person to take over. He was not elected. It was Abu Bakr. There was a council that got together and elected the next leader. And it was Abu Bakr, a good friend of the Prophet's. And the people who were sort of like, so to speak, followers of Ali were pretty upset about that, but they had to accept it. After Abu Bakr passed away, Omar was chosen. And again, Ali's followers were pretty unhappy about that, but they had to accept it. Then when Omar passed away, Uthman became the third caliph. And by this time, I think Ali's followers were just outraged. They were saying, how is this possible that one of the very first Muslims and one of the most pious people, how do you keep overlooking him? He's family of the Prophet. Like, how can this happen? So Islamic history says, and there's different versions of this, that some of Ali's friends or somebody that was allied with Ali had something to do with Uthman's death or murder. And then Ali became the last caliph before the next set of rulers took over. And then up above, I'm showing a picture of the Prophet's grandson, who was this is another bit of history that has caused a lot of conflict, and the main reason why there's that Shia and Sunni schism right now. Hussein, again, who was the Prophet's grandson and who maybe could have been in line to become one of the next leaders, was killed basically by Zaid, who was, I'm trying to find my notes. Yeah, so he was basically killed as he was on his way to Kufa with his family and his children. He was unarmed. And this is considered a huge tragedy. But so we can see how so quickly after the death of the Prophet, the tribal rivalries just came right back and caused great sorrow. Okay. And another sign that we see of these, of red and blue sort of mixing, is the spread with which the Umayyad Caliphate spread, which was after the first four caliphs. And so my thought is that there's like the blue ideology, but with that red imperialistic impulse that kind of pushed the spread so quickly into other territories. And then we get into orange. And this is the Islamic Golden Age, okay, which was from the mid-8th century to the 13th century. And in Baghdad, which is where a lot of translation initiatives flourished, we had the translation of philosophical and very important philosophical works, mathematical, astronomical, and so on. And if it wasn't for some of those translation efforts, and in the West, we would have lost a lot of important philosophical works. We had important physicians like Ibn Sina, who was also a philosopher and a thinker, Al-Razi, who made a lot of progress in the field of medicine. He discovered alcohol and sulfuric acid, and he wrote about smallpox and how to treat it. Green. Now, some will say that green is a recent manifestation and that we can't really apply green so far back in time. I would say that there were green expressions. I really like that word, expressions, because there can be expressions of levels before a society has a field of gravity in that place. And for example, Bilal, he was a slave and one of the first converts to Islam, and he was freed. And he actually was the first one to do the adhan, that's the call to prayer. And he became a very important part of the early Muslim community. And so there was, in the Prophet's last speech, before he passed away, he stated that, that everybody was equal regardless of race, and that an Arab was not better than a non-Arab, and black was not, white was not better than black. Let's see if I can find my notes and actually read that, because it's quite beautiful. Okay, I don't see that, but that's the gist of it, basically. So this idea of equality was already present back then. And then we also have, in the south of Spain, where I live, a period of time, Al-Andalus, where there was coexistence with Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities. And another thing that is quite beautiful is that during this period of time in Al-Andalus, there was a cultural, agricultural revolution. And I read somewhere that there were more than 400 types of plants, medicinal and for consumption, that were grown. And so there's great diversity in agriculture. And after the Muslims and Jews were forced to leave, that number dropped from 400 and something to only 100 and something types of things that were cultivated. So there was actually something lost when that Muslim population was forced to exit from Europe. Okay, now I'm going to point the arrow backwards. So I have a sense that a lot of people, when they hear the word Islam, whether they want to or not, they unconsciously make a connection with terrorism. And, you know, it's not surprising because that's something that the media, and for good reason, tends to highlight. And it is unfortunate that there are actually groups of Muslims that do interpret and live their ideas through like what I consider to be a very regressive sort of red, my way or the highway, using violence. And sort of the most horrific examples for me being what ISIS did with Yazidi women who enslaved them and, you know, found justification because during the Prophet's time, there were slaves. And even though the Prophet encouraged people to free slaves, it was never ruled out completely. Like it was never prohibited. It was just, you know, there was an attempt to phase it out. But so ISIS thinks that because slaves existed and the practice was there during the time of Islam, it's perfectly okay to do that now. I'm sorry, I think my Ethernet connection just dropped. Okay. So I'm going to talk about Islam in the West because that's my particular interest. I'm not going to talk about Islam in the Middle East because I really don't have that much experience. And I want to start with this quote that Muhammad Abdu said once. He's an Egyptian scholar. He said, "I went to the West and saw Islam, but no Muslims. I got back to the East and saw Muslims, but not Islam." So what I take that to mean, how I understand that, is that he went to the West and he saw the kind of ethics that he expected Muslims to be following, but weren't, even though they weren't Muslim. And back in the East, he saw people who were on the exterior Muslims and supposedly following Islam, but their ethics or their way of behaving towards each other did not reflect that. And I have Muslim friends that firmly believe that actually it's easier to be a Muslim in the West than in the Middle East or in a Muslim majority country, because you can be more authentic. It's a choice that you're making. It's not something that you're doing in a false sense sort of way. This is a picture of the largest mosque in the United States, which is in Dearborn, Michigan, which is also where the largest Muslim community is. I thought this picture was really cute. This is a group of Muslim high school students performing Frozen. So we have Elsa and Anna, and I think it's hilarious to see them, you know, in their hijabs and belting it out. Let it go, let it go. Just seeing two cultures melt together. It's, I think, really sweet. I love to see things like that. And I think it's very interesting that in Dearborn and in other Muslim communities, and Muslims in general, I think, tend to lean liberal, which is kind of interesting when you think that, you know, the religion of Islam seems so conservative and is in certain ways, certainly. But there's a lot of Bernie supporters, and we know that two of the most prominent Muslim representatives are, I'm trying to remember their names, because I know their names very well, but no, for some reason I'm blocking them. Anyway, you know who they are.
Omar Iliad is the woman on the right.
And Rashida Tlaib. And, you know, they're both Bernie supporters. So it's quite interesting that there's that sort of left-leaning tendency. And this is a photo of a group of sisters in Philadelphia. So this is where I used to live. And there's a lot of African-American converts in Philadelphia. And so I think the whole convert phenomenon in the United States is quite interesting. And I think for the African American community, it has been a really, really wonderful thing, because a lot of African communities have been very broken, stemming from, slaves that were brought over here by force, and who uh, are suffering from generational trauma, and society has not really allowed them or given them the way to create healthy, stable families and communities. And Islam has given them that community, that what I see as that positive sense of blue that was missing. And this is where Malcolm X comes in. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. His story is very similar to a lot of African American converts. He came from a broken family. He was into a life of crime. He went to prison. And when he was in prison, he found somebody who taught him about Islam, and it really changed his life around. He stopped drinking alcohol. He started reading books, and he became a Muslim, and basically became a much better person. Now, he did belong to the Nation of Islam when he first joined, when he first became a Muslim. And the Nation of Islam was a bit radical in the sense that they thought that white people were devils and things like that. Although I think it's a natural counter reaction to the kind of racism that African Americans had experienced. So kind of like that need for that red anger that's to sort of express itself through the Nation of Islam. I think it's quite understandable. Through the use of reason, which is very orange, he was able to become a great debater. And also through the use of reason, he eventually left the Nation of Islam because he realized that it was a bit cultish. He became just a mainstream Sunni practitioner. He eventually went to Mecca to do pilgrimage. And I love this story so much because when he saw people circling the Kaaba from all over the world, black, white, every color in the rainbow. Okay, maybe not every color in the rainbow, but anyway, he realized for the first time that it was actually possible for there to be racial equality. Before that, he hadn't really believed it. He thought Martin Luther King was just like a hopeless idealist that not based in reality, and that it was impossible. But actually, it was not what he witnessed in America, because a lot of times Americans think that America is at the forefront of racial equality. And it wasn't being in America that made Malcolm consider that racial equality was possible. It was traveling to Mecca. Okay, another example is Grace Song, who's actually somebody who I know. So I hope if she ever sees this, she doesn't mind me talking about her. She came from a Chinese immigrant family, worked hard to sort of fit into the American, mold, and was working in the corporate sector, sort of like a very orange environment, and she felt something was missing in her life, though, and she eventually found Islam and became Muslim. And she would go to her corporate day job, but then on the weekends or at night, she would go to the mosque. But she would get some really strange advice. The people there seemed to be trying to put her in a box that she didn't feel comfortable with. And luckily, she talks about meeting her husband, who was a renowned scholar, Dr. Abul Fadl, who's written a lot of great books, including Reasoning with God, which I think is a great book for anybody to read. He debunked a lot of the cultural practices and assumptions that a lot of born Muslims have, and try to like inculcate converts with, like, you have to do, you can't wear nail polish, and you must wear hijab the moment you convert, and all this kind of stuff. And so he sort of debunked a lot of stuff for her, coming from the scholarly perspective himself. So she feels like she got lucky, because a lot of converts actually don't have that. And Hamza Yusuf, who grew up in a very liberal California family, he became Muslim. He went to Mauritania to study with sheikhs there. And he eventually founded Zaytuna College in Berkeley. I don't know if you guys know of this place, but it's the first and maybe the only liberal arts Islamic college in the United States. But I think it's quite fascinating that it's both an Islamic seminary and a liberal arts college. And I want to read this, but actually I can't see a part of it because the Zoom windows are blocking it. Let me see if I can try to read it. He says, we Muslims are unpersuaded by many of the triumphalist claims made by the West, but are essentially happy with its core values. As a Westerner, the child of a civil rights and anti-war activist, I embraced Islam, not an abandonment of my core values, drawn almost entirely from the progressive tradition, but as an affirmation of them, and have since studied Islamic law for 10 years with traditionally trained scholars. And while some particulars in medieval legal texts have troubled me, never have the universals been in conflict with anything my progressive California mother taught me. Instead, I've marveled at how most of what Westerner society claims as its own highest ideals are deeply rooted in Islamic tradition. Now, I have to say that I've heard Hamza Yusuf speak in different contexts, and for example, the World Economic Forum. And when he's with other economists or sociologists, he's totally on their level speaking their language. And then when he's with Muslims, he's speaking like a very traditional sort of scholarly language. So he's able to sort of morph according to his audience. Although I do feel like even though he comes from a very green background, I feel like because he started a seminary that he mostly expresses in blue. Can religious institutions, particularly Islamic religious institutions, evolve? I don't know. I would say that traditional, and these bar graphs are totally made up. They don't actually represent anything. They're my own interpretation of the numbers. I would say that traditional scholars make up, obviously, the vast majority of scholarly opinion. What do traditional scholars believe? Well, for example, let's take the case of inheritance. Usually a woman inherits half of what a man inherits, which, by the way, at the time of the Prophet was progress. Before the time of the Prophet, women didn't inherit at all. You know, we can look at Islamic rulings and say, oh, how backwards, this is so backwards. But if you look at what it represented at the time, it actually was progressive at the time. So traditional scholars will say, look, you know, the Qur'an says the women have to receive half the inheritance. That's the way it's going to be. We're not going to, okay, it's my timer says it's been half an hour, but I'm going to keep going unless someone stops me. So traditional scholars will say women have to inherit half. Maybe there's some exceptions for that. We can study case by case, but in general, that's the case. Whereas progressive scholars will feel okay about using reason, and they'll say, look, Islam just tried to start a movement, and we need to continue that movement. It was there to improve things, and we can continue to improve things. We don't have to do things exactly the way we did them then. If a woman works and the same as a man, there's no reason why she should also only inherit half. And then there are the boundary breaking thinkers, which I have some quotes here, but I think I'm going to skip ahead to get to a few more slides. But those are the ones that basically said that Sharia is not really appropriate at all for today's time, that the Sharia was made for a time where people couldn't really reason for themselves, and that's not the case anymore. Oh, and then there's the ultra-conservative Saudi-based Salafism, which is part of the traditional scholarship, but not the sum total, but they tend to have the loudest voice. Okay, I'm just going to skip. Actually, that's not showing up right. Never mind, so I'm going to skip that slide. And one more thing I want to say is that there's a website called Islam QA, and it is the number one site for getting information about Islam, getting your questions answered about Islam. And yet the sheikh that started this is an ultra-conservative Salafi sheikh who believes that, you know, homosexuality is a horrendous crime, that all idols need to be destroyed, that slavery, there's still situations where maybe slavery could be permitted, things like this. So this guy, who in my mind has extreme positions, has started this platform, which is, and it's probably because it was one of the earliest internet platforms for getting your questions on Islam answered. But this website continues to be the most prevalent one that pops up in your search results when you look, when you type a question about Islam. And I think that's extremely troubling because especially if there's somebody that converts to Islam and they look for an answer, that's the site that they're going to find first before any others. On the other hand, there are lots of like subcultures in social media, and there are groups in Facebook where you have really super alternative Muslims who are questioning everything and who don't feel that they need to rely on any scholar anymore, like that we basically have our own mind to make decisions. Second tier expressions. I'm just going to mention a few people that I think are expressing in second tier. I really can't say who, as an individual is second tier. It's impossible for me to say, but these are just expressions. So this is Amina Wadud, who is one of the few women who's bold enough to pray, to lead men in prayers, because it's a big no-no in Islam. It's only men can lead the prayers. So she has led prayers before. It's been quite controversial, but she's a pretty cool lady. And she says we're at the very tip of the creation of the entire universe, and language is a recent development for us. So communication in a language from a divine source to human beings is a very special part of our capacity as humans. And yet it's not the sum total. Sorry, this text is partly blocked for me. So she's talking about how in the time of the Quran, there was slavery, and that's not acceptable today. So that means we have to have a dynamic relationship with the virtues and values that were presented in the Quran. And it's not literally going to be the same in the 7th century, 17th, or in the future, the 27th century. We have Reza Aslan, who says that Islam is a man-made institution. It's a set of symbols and metaphors that provide a language in which to express what is inexpressible, and that is faith. It's symbols and metaphors that I prefer, but it's not more right or more wrong than other symbols and metaphors. It's a language, that is all. And Dr. Farhad Shafti, which I have to give a disclaimer, is a friend of mine, and in fact, we just put out a podcast together. He says the obsession with converting people to Islam, which basically means following the Sharia of Islam, can cloud one's mind to realizing the real universal function of the Quran. Once it is appreciated that God's religion is not bound by any particular law, suddenly the real message becomes clear, available to all human beings, whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim. And then an article called The True Meaning of the Universality of the Quran, which I think is quite an important article, which I hope will get out more. I hope more Muslims will read it. He has a PhD in interpretation of the Quran. Okay, so he knows the Quran inside and out. And while most Muslims will say the Quran is universal in the sense that everybody, it's just like Christians that say, if you believe in Jesus, you will be saved. And that is the only path to salvation. Muslims can do the same thing. Okay, Muslims oftentimes feel that if you don't accept Islam, then who can say what will happen to you in the afterlife? So Dr. Shafti, who understands the Quran very well, has said that in general, the message of the Quran was tailored for the people over Arabia at that time, and that the Quran itself says that. And he does a very elaborate analysis in this article. The Quran, there are several verses that specify that the Quran was revealed for those people, for example, and thus we have revealed to you an Arabic Quran so that you warn the mother city, that's Mecca, and those around it, and that you may give warning on the day of gathering together wherein there's no doubt. And this is a reminder for you and your people, and soon you will be questioned. And this is a revelation from the mighty and merciful for people whose forefathers were not warned and were ignorant. In other words, this is a message for you, because where other people have a message, have a book, you don't. So this is a message for you. And each nation receives its own guidance. You are only a warner, and for every people there is a guide. And for every community there's a messenger, so when their message comes, they will be judged with fairness and they will not be wronged. And verily we raise the messenger for every community. Now, if you don't like this concept of messenger, or you don't even sort of believe in the whole Abrahamic tradition. You can think of it as that, every community or even every individual, if they're truly seeking, will find that those personal truths that they're looking for. Okay, that was my own interpretation. That's not in the Quran. And diversity of paths toward God. Okay, and in every direction of worship, there are people associated with it. So compete with each other in goodness wherever you are, and God will gather you all. God has power over everything. And the followers of Injil are the 4 Gospels, should rule based on what God has sent in it. And whoever does not, and whoever does, I can't read that, rule based on what God has sent to them, then verily. So whoever does not follow what God has sent to them, they are the transgressors. And then, I don't know if I should read all these. I'm going to read the second one. So those who believe in Prophet Muhammad and the Jews and the Sabians and the Christians and any of them who truly believe in God and the hereafter and do righteous deeds, there will be no grief on them. Okay. So what can we take from this? Okay. That there's a beautiful and rich message in the Quran that transmits the unity of God. And if your language is not that of God, you can use spirit, universe, divine essence, unified field, whatever best resonates with you. This message encourages moral behavior. I think this is the most important thing that the Quran is trying to do. This message resonates even today, since people who read the Quran are taken by it and choose to adopt this faith if they're not born with it. Okay, even though the process of conversion can create a sort of a hardship for certain people. However, the Quran was tailored for the people of Arabia at the time, so the practices and rulings do not necessarily, I believe, are not necessarily directly transferable to today's time without some serious cultural and historical translation. So it's not just about translating the Arabic, it's about understanding the culture. It's about understanding the history, and it's also about being sensitive to what our needs are today. It drives me crazy when ultra-Orthodox sheikhs in Saudi Arabia think that they can tell a young woman in the UK who maybe has become interested in Islam how she should lead her life, that like this person knows anything about her life in a completely different context and coming from a completely different worldview. So I think it's something that we need to be sensitive to. Okay, I'm just gonna drop some marketing here for my podcast that I've done with Dr. Farhad Shafti, who I mentioned a moment ago. It's called One Light, Dialogues on Religion with Dr. Farhad Shafti. Our main goal really is to talk about religion in general, but we use the Islamic framework because we really think there isn't enough dialogue coming from people, and now I'm referring to him, he's an expert on the Quran, who can bring a much more open-minded worldview that will allow much more flexibility in how we approach Islam and the Quran. And with that, I'll finish up. If you have any doubts or concerns, I'd love to hear about it. I'd love to hear what's new that you learned about Islam, but we could do that after the breakout sessions. I think during the breakout sessions, it'd be interesting to talk about what your relationship to religion is, and to talk about if you're feeling optimistic or pessimistic about the role of religion in the future.